The early morning sun cast long shadows across the steps of Montgomery County Courthouse as Sarah Bennett walked up the worn stone stairs. She was running 5 minutes late, something that always made her nervous, but today it couldn't be helped. The city bus had been delayed, and she couldn't afford a taxi after spending most of her money on her car repairs last week. Sarah held her old leather briefcase close to her chest. Inside were the precious drafts of her newest poetry collection, which she had been working on at her favorite coffee shop before heading to court. The briefcase was a gift from her grandmother, who had always believed in her writing talent, even when nobody else did. As she pushed through the heavy wooden doors, the cool air inside the courthouse hit her face. The building smelled of old papers and wood polish, mixed with the faint scent of coffee from the security guard station. Sarah joined the line of people waiting to go through the metal detector, shifting her weight from one foot to another as she watched others in front of her empty their pockets. Next, called the security guard, a tall man with kind eyes. Sarah placed her briefcase on the conveyor belt and walked through the detector. It beeped loudly, making her jump. She had forgotten to remove her watch, a simple timepiece that had been her mother's. "Step back and remove any metal items, ma'am," the guard said. Sarah quickly took off her watch and walked through again. This time there was no beep. She gathered her belongings, checking inside her briefcase to make sure all her papers were still in order. The main hallway was busy with people rushing in different directions. Lawyers in expensive suits walked quickly, their shoes clicking against the marble floor. Worried-looking people sat on wooden benches, some alone, others whispering to family members. Sarah checked the court schedule posted on the wall and found her name. Courtroom 3B, Judge Richard Whitman, 9:30 a.m. She climbed the stairs to the third floor, her heart beating a little faster with each step. Sarah had never been in trouble with the law before. The traffic ticket she had received seemed unfair. She was sure the light had been yellow, not red. But now, standing in this imposing building, she felt small and uncertain. Outside courtroom 3B, Sarah found an empty spot on a wooden bench and sat down. She watched as a young mother tried to quiet her crying baby, and an elderly man nervously adjusted his tie. The wooden doors to the courtroom were closed, and a sign read "Court in Session" in bright red letters. While waiting, Sarah pulled out her poetry drafts. Writing had always calmed her nerves, and she had some time before her case would be called. Her latest collection explored themes of justice and equality, inspired by her experiences growing up in the South. The irony of editing these poems while waiting for her court appearance wasn't lost on her. At 9:25 a.m., a court officer opened the heavy doors. "All rise." His voice echoed through the hallway. People began filing into the courtroom, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Sarah put her papers back in her briefcase and followed the crowd inside. The courtroom was larger than she had expected. Rows of wooden benches filled the room, and large windows let in streams of sunlight. American flags stood on either side of the judge's bench, which was raised high above the floor. The whole setup seemed designed to make people feel small and powerless. Sarah found a seat in the middle row, placing her briefcase carefully under the bench. She watched as the clerk organized papers on his desk and the bailiff checked his phone one last time before putting it away. The air in the room felt thick with tension and anxiety. As the clock struck 9:30, the bailiff's voice rang out again. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Richard Whitman." The rustle of clothes and shuffling of feet filled the room as everyone stood. Sarah smoothed down her simple dress and stood straight, trying to project confidence she didn't quite feel. Through a door behind the bench, Judge Whitman entered the courtroom. He was a tall man with gray hair and wire-rimmed glasses, wearing the traditional black robe. His face showed no emotion as he sat down and picked up his gavel. The sound of it hitting the wooden block echoed through the silent courtroom, marking the beginning of what would become a very unexpected day. Judge Richard Whitman sat in his high-backed leather chair, looking down at the stack of cases for the day. He had been doing this job for 15 years, and some days, all the faces started to blur together. Today was already testing his patience. 3 people had tried to argue their way out of clear traffic violations, and it wasn't even 10 a.m. yet. "Next case," he called out, not bothering to look up from his papers. "Sarah Bennett, traffic violation, running a red light on Oak Street." His voice carried the weariness of someone who had heard every excuse in the book. Sarah stood up slowly, clutching her worn leather briefcase. As she walked to the front of the courtroom, she could feel everyone's eyes on her. Her simple cotton dress and comfortable riding shoes suddenly felt out of place in the formal courtroom. She had chosen comfort over style that morning, planning to spend the day writing at her usual cafe after what she thought would be a quick court appearance. Judge Whitman finally looked up, his eyes barely scanning over Sarah before returning to his papers. His first impression was exactly what he expected. Another person who probably wouldn't take responsibility for their actions. He'd seen thousands of cases like this before, or so he thought. "Miss Bennet," he said, his voice carrying that special tone of authority that judges perfect over years on the bench. "You're charged with running a red light on Oak Street on September 15th at 2:45 p.m. How do you plead?" Sarah cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. The light was yellow when I entered the intersection." "Miss Bennet," Judge Whitman interrupted, his voice sharp. "I asked for your plea, not your explanation. Guilty or not guilty?" The courtroom fell silent. Even the usual shuffling of papers and quiet whispers stopped. Sarah stood straighter, her fingers tightening around the handle of her briefcase. Inside were the drafts of her poems about justice and dignity, about standing up for what's right. The irony wasn't lost on her. "Not guilty, Your Honor," she said firmly, her voice clear and steady despite her racing heart. Judge Whitman sighed, the kind of heavy sigh that suggested he'd heard it all before. He picked up the police report, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Officer Johnson's report states clearly that your vehicle entered the intersection 3 seconds after the light turned red. Are you suggesting the officer's report is incorrect?" Before Sarah could answer, he continued, "I see you also have an unpaid parking ticket from 3 months ago. Would you care to explain that?" Sarah opened her briefcase, looking for the receipt that would prove she had actually paid that ticket. As she searched, a few papers slipped out, floating to the floor. She bent down to pick them up, her face flushing with embarrassment. "We don't have all day, Miss Bennet," Judge Whitman said, his tone dismissive. He turned to his clerk, speaking in a lower voice that still carried across the quiet courtroom. Typical. They never come prepared. A young law clerk sitting nearby watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. He had been organizing some files when something caught his eye, one of the papers that had fallen from Sarah's briefcase. His eyes widened as he recognized the letterhead of the New York Times Book Review. Judge Whitman, unaware of this, continued his lecture. "Miss Bennet, this court sees dozens of cases like yours every day. People who think the rules don't apply to them, who always have an excuse. The traffic laws exist for everyone's safety." Sarah stood quietly, her dignity intact despite the judge's condescending tone. She had faced prejudice before, had written about it in her poems that were now scattered at her feet. The same poems that had touched thousands of readers, that had made her a voice for those who often went unheard. The young clerk was now frantically trying to get the judge's attention, holding one of Sarah's fallen papers. But Judge Whitman was too focused on making his point, too sure of his first impressions to notice that he was about to learn a valuable lesson about judging books and people by their covers. The tension in courtroom 3B grew thicker as Judge Whitman leaned forward in his chair. His face showed the kind of frustration that comes from years of hearing excuses. The morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows did nothing to soften his stern expression. "Miss Bennet," he said, tapping his pen against the desk, "your record shows a pattern of disregard for traffic laws. First the unpaid parking ticket, and now running a red light. Do you have anything to say in your defense?" Sarah took a deep breath before speaking. She had spent years writing about moments like these, about the weight of prejudice and the strength it takes to stand tall under its pressure. "Your Honor, I can show you the receipt for that parking ticket. It was paid 2 days after I received it." Judge Whitman waved his hand dismissively. "If it was paid, why isn't it showing up in our system? Are you suggesting our records are wrong?" His voice carried a hint of mockery that made several people in the courtroom shift uncomfortably in their seats. The young clerk, David Martinez, was still trying to get the judge's attention. He had read the newspaper article that had fallen from Sarah's briefcase, and his hands were shaking with the realization of who was standing before them. But Judge Whitman was too focused on his lecture to notice. "Furthermore, Miss Bennet," the judge continued, his voice rising, "you chose to challenge this ticket instead of paying it. That's your right, of course, but it means you're wasting not only your time but the court's time as well." Sarah opened her briefcase again, careful not to drop any more papers. "Your Honor, I have evidence that might help explain. Evidence? Judge Whitman interrupted, letting out a short, harsh laugh. Unless you have a video showing the light was yellow, I don't see what evidence could possibly change the officer's report. The people sitting in the courtroom watched the scene unfold like a slow-motion car crash. Some looked away, embarrassed by the judge's tone. Others leaned forward, sensing that something unexpected was about to happen. Sarah's voice remained steady, though her hands had balled into fists at her sides. "Sir, I understand you're busy, but if you could just give me a moment to—" "Miss Bennett," Judge Whitman cut her off again, his patience clearly gone. "I'm going to make this simple. Given your previous violation and your attitude today, I'm doubling the original fine. You'll pay $500, and I suggest you take this as a lesson in respecting the law." The young clerk couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Your Honor," he called out, his voice cracking slightly, "there's something you need to see." Judge Whitman turned to the clerk, irritation clear on his face. "Mr. Martinez, you know better than to interrupt court proceedings. What could possibly be so important?" David Martinez held up the newspaper article with shaking hands. "Sir, Miss Bennett she's Sarah Bennett, the poet. Her latest book about justice and racial equality just won the National Book Award. She was on the cover of the New York Times Book Review last Sunday." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Several people pulled out their phones, quickly searching her name. Sarah stood quietly, her face showing neither triumph nor anger. She had been in this position before, being underestimated, being judged before being heard. It was what had driven her to write in the first place. Judge Whitman's face began to change color. First red, then a shade paler than usual. He remembered his wife talking about a powerful new poetry collection just last week. She had read him a passage about prejudice in the justice system, about the importance of looking beyond first impressions. He had agreed with every word, never imagining he would find himself playing the role of the very person the poem criticized. The silence in the courtroom grew heavy as the judge looked down at his papers, then back at Sarah. His wire-rimmed glasses slipped slightly down his nose, and for the first time that morning, he truly saw the person standing before him. The next words he would speak would change them both, but for now, the silence spoke volumes about assumptions, justice, and the power of revelation. The courtroom remained silent as Judge Whitman stared at the newspaper article in his hands. His fingers trembled slightly as he read the headline. "Sarah Bennett's Justice in Verses becomes national bestseller." Below it was a photo of the same woman who stood before him, dressed elegantly at a book signing event. David Martinez, the young clerk, stepped forward with more papers he had gathered from the floor. "Your Honor, there's more," he said, his voice stronger now. "Miss Bennett's poems are being taught in universities across the country. She's won 3 major literary awards this year alone." People in the courtroom began whispering among themselves. Some were pulling out books from their bags. Her books. As it turned out, 2 people in the audience had come to court carrying copies of her latest collection, hoping to get them signed after attending her reading at the local library later that day. Judge Whitman placed the article down carefully, as if it might burn his fingers. He remembered more clearly now. His wife had been reading this very book at breakfast just last week. She had read him a powerful passage about a black woman being dismissed by authority figures who couldn't see past their own prejudices. The irony of the situation hit him like a physical blow. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice notably softer than before. I believe we got off on the wrong foot here." He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, suddenly looking tired and much older. Sarah stood straight, her dignity intact. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a neat folder. "Your Honor, I have the receipt for the paid parking ticket right here," she said calmly. "And regarding today's case, I also have photographs of the intersection taken immediately after the incident." A woman in the audience raised her hand nervously. "Excuse me," she said when the judge nodded at her. "I'm a literature professor at the local college. We're actually studying Miss Bennett's poem Blind Justice in my class this semester. It's about moments exactly like this one." The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom. Several people nodded, and someone in the back row even clapped briefly before being hushed by the bailiff. Judge Whitman looked at the receipt Sarah had presented. It clearly showed the parking ticket had been paid on time. He then examined the intersection photos, which cast reasonable doubt on the officer's claim about the red light. "Miss Bennet," he said, clearing his throat, "would you be willing to share some of your work with the court?" His voice carried a hint of both shame and hope. Sarah pulled out a worn notebook from her briefcase. The pages were dog-eared and filled with handwritten notes. She turned to a specific page and began to read. "Before you judge my story, make sure you've read the page, not just glanced at the cover, and assumed you knew my age, my race, my truth, my journey." Her voice filled the courtroom, strong and clear. Even the bailiff stopped shuffling papers to listen. The words seemed to float in the air, making everyone present reflect on their own prejudices and assumptions. Judge Whitman listened intently, his earlier arrogance replaced by genuine attention. Each word seemed to hit him personally, describing exactly what he had done just minutes before. The power of her poetry, combined with the reality of his actions, created a moment of true understanding. When Sarah finished reading, there was a moment of complete silence. Then, slowly, people began to applaud. The judge didn't stop them this time. Instead, he looked directly at Sarah, seeing her, truly seeing her, for the first time since she'd entered his courtroom. The next few minutes would change both their lives forever, but for now, the simple power of words and truth hung in the air, transforming a mundane traffic court into a place of unexpected revelation and learning. Judge Whitman sat back in his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on him like a heavy blanket. The article from the New York Times lay on his desk, along with several other newspaper clippings that had fallen from Sarah's briefcase. Each one praised her work, describing how her poetry had touched thousands of lives. "Last week," he began, his voice different now, softer and filled with realization, "my wife read me a poem about justice. She was so moved by it that she cried." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "It was your poem, wasn't it? The one about a young girl watching her father being misjudged by people who never gave him a chance to explain." Sarah nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. That poem is called Father's Dignity. I wrote it after watching my father, a high school principal, being repeatedly mistaken for a janitor at his own school." The courtroom was completely silent now. Even the usual sounds of papers shuffling and chairs creaking had stopped. Everyone was watching this unexpected scene unfold, like witnessing a rare natural phenomenon. Judge Whitman picked up one of the newspaper clippings. "It says here that your latest collection spent 12 weeks on the bestseller list. That your words have helped change how people think about justice and prejudice." He removed his glasses again, this time placing them carefully on his desk. "And here I am, proving exactly why your words are still so necessary." A woman in the third row raised her hand timidly. When the judge nodded, she stood up. "I'm a high school teacher," she said. "We studied Miss Bennet's poem Morning Court last semester. The students said it helped them understand their own biases better." She looked at Sarah with admiration. "I never thought I'd actually see you in person." More people began sharing their stories. A young man mentioned how her poems had helped him understand his grandmother's struggles. An elderly woman admitted to keeping Sarah's book by her bedside, reading it every night for strength. Judge Whitman listened to each story, his face showing increasing understanding. He picked up Sarah's traffic ticket and looked at it again, this time seeing it with new eyes. "Miss Bennet," he said, "your photographs of the intersection raise reasonable doubt about the officer's report. And your parking ticket receipt clearly shows timely payment." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "But that's not the real issue here, is it?" Sarah stood quietly, her presence now commanding respect rather than dismissal. The same simple dress and comfortable shoes that had led to his earlier assumptions now seemed to represent something different, the authenticity of a writer who chose substance over appearance. "No, Your Honor," she replied. "The real issue is much larger than a traffic ticket." The judge nodded slowly. "In your poem, Blind Justice, you wrote about how true justice requires us to look past our first impressions, how we must work harder to see each person's full story." He looked around his courtroom with new eyes. "I failed to do that today." David Martinez, the clerk who had first recognized Sarah, stepped forward with a copy of her book. "Miss Bennet, would you mind signing this? Your words helped me decide to go to law school. I want to be part of making the changes you write about." Sarah took the book with a gentle smile. As she signed it, Judge Whitman made a decision that would change how he approached every case that came before him in the future. The morning sun had shifted now, casting different shadows in the courtroom. They seemed to symbolize how perspectives had shifted as well. how recognition had transformed a routine traffic court session into something much more meaningful. The same room that had earlier felt cold and intimidating now held a warmth of understanding. And through it all, Sarah Bennett stood with the same quiet dignity she had shown from the beginning, proof that sometimes the most powerful teaching comes not from preaching, but from simply being who you are. Judge Whitman stood up from his chair, something he rarely did during court proceedings. The action surprised everyone in the courtroom, as it broke all usual protocols. He stepped down from his high bench, removing his black robe as he did so. "Miss Bennett," he said, now standing on the same level as her, "would you share with us the poem you wrote about courtrooms? I believe it was called Judgment Day. My wife tells me it's the most powerful piece in your collection." Sarah opened her worn notebook again, turning to a page marked with a blue sticky note. The courtroom remained completely silent, every person leaning forward slightly, eager to hear her words. "Are you sure, Your Honor?" she asked quietly. "The poem is quite direct." He nodded, gesturing to the space in front of his bench. "I think we all need to hear it, especially me." Sarah walked to the center of the courtroom. She stood straight, her simple dress and comfortable shoes now seeming more appropriate than ever. When she began to read, her voice carried the weight of years of experience. In these halls of marble and wood, where justice is served like daily bread, some get feast, while others get crumbs, based on faces, clothes, and things unsaid. Behind the bench sits power and might, looking down from heights so tall. But true justice needs no elevation. When wisdom breaks the prejudice wall, black or white, rich or poor, each story deserves its proper time. For justice blind is justice true, when hearts and minds align. As Sarah's voice faded, Judge Whitman sat down heavily in one of the courtroom's public benches. He looked different now, smaller, more human. The young clerk, David, wiped tears from his eyes, and several people in the audience were nodding in understanding. "I've been a judge for 15 years, Judge Whitman said, his voice thick with emotion. "I prided myself on being fair, on following the law, but today, I realize that following the law isn't enough if we don't also open our hearts and minds to each person who stands before us." An elderly man in the back of the courtroom raised his hand. When Sarah nodded at him, he spoke with a shaking voice. "My granddaughter gave me your book last Christmas. I was a judge too, before I retired. Your words made me think about all the times I might have been too quick to judge, too sure of my first impressions." Sarah listened respectfully, her notebook still open in her hands. She had written these poems alone in her small apartment, never imagining they would echo through a real courtroom, touching the very people who had the power to make changes. Judge Whitman stood up again, this time walking over to Sarah. "Miss Bennett, I owe you an apology. But more than that, I owe you a thank you. Your words today have taught me more about justice than 15 years on this bench." The bailiff, who had been standing quietly in his corner, suddenly spoke up. "Ma'am, would you mind if I bought a copy of your book? I think it's something all of us who work in the court system should read." Sarah smiled warmly. "I'd be happy to arrange for copies to be available in the courthouse library." She turned to Judge Whitman. "Sometimes, Your Honor, the best way to learn is through our mistakes. Your willingness to listen and change is exactly what my poems are about." The morning had turned into early afternoon, and sunlight now streamed directly through the high windows, creating bright patches on the courtroom floor. In one of these patches of light stood Sarah and the judge, two people who had started the day as opposing figures but now stood together as teachers and learners. The traffic ticket that had brought them together lay forgotten on the judge's bench, now just a small piece of paper that had somehow sparked a moment of transformation in this room of law and order. The story of what happened in courtroom 3B spread quickly through the city. By evening, local news websites had already posted articles with headlines like "Poetry Meets Justice," "Bestselling Author Changes Judge's Perspective," and "Courthouse Confrontation Leads to Unexpected Learning Moment." Sarah Bennett sat in her favorite coffee shop the next morning, looking at her phone in amazement. Her social media notifications wouldn't stop buzzing. People from all over the country were sharing the story, adding their own experiences with prejudice in the justice system. "Mind if I join you?" a familiar voice asked. Sarah looked up to see David Martinez, the young clerk from yesterday's court session. He held a cup of coffee and looked nervous, like a student meeting their favorite teacher. please," Sarah said, gesturing to the empty chair across from her. Her laptop was open, showing dozens of unread emails from news reporters wanting to hear her side of the story. "The courthouse is different today," David said, settling into the chair. "Judge Whitman called a meeting with all the staff this morning. He talked about what happened yesterday and admitted his mistakes. I've never seen anything like it." Sarah took a sip of her tea, thinking about how one small moment could create such big changes. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her publisher. "They want me to write about what happened," she explained to David. "They think it could help other courts understand the importance of looking past first impressions." Outside the coffee shop, people walked past the window, some doing double takes when they recognized Sarah from the news. A young woman even pressed her nose against the glass, holding up Sarah's book with an excited wave. "You won't believe what else happened," David continued, leaning forward. "The other judges are requesting copies of your books. And not just for themselves, they want them in every courtroom. Judge Whitman even suggested starting a book club for court employees." Sarah smiled, remembering how different Judge Whitman had looked after hearing her poem. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a text from the judge himself. "Miss Bennett, would you consider speaking at our judicial conference next month? Your words have power that needs to be heard by more people in our profession." As Sarah typed her reply, a group of law students entered the coffee shop. They carried thick textbooks and tired expressions, but their faces lit up when they recognized her. "Miss Bennett," one of them called out, "we just studied your case in our ethics class. Professor Thompson used it as an example of how bias can affect justice. Would you mind if we asked you a few questions?" The students gathered around her table, pulling out notebooks and phones to record her answers. Their questions showed how deeply yesterday's events had affected them. "How did you stay so calm? What gave you the strength to stand up to authority? Do you think poetry can really change the legal system?" Sarah answered each question thoughtfully, watching as the students wrote down her words. She noticed how David listened too, nodding along as if hearing the answers to questions he'd been afraid to ask. Later that afternoon, Sarah received an email from a national organization of judges. They wanted to create a training program based on her poetry, teaching new judges about the importance of looking beyond appearances. The local library called to say they'd sold out of her books. The courthouse gift shop, which usually only sold legal textbooks and souvenirs, had ordered 100 copies. Even the coffee shop owner asked if she would do a reading there next week. As the sun started to set, Sarah opened her notebook to write. She had a new poem forming in her mind about how justice sometimes comes in unexpected ways and how change can start with just one person willing to admit their mistakes. Her phone buzzed one last time for the day. It was a photo from the courthouse. Judge Whitman had replaced the stern portrait behind his bench with a framed copy of her poem Judgment Day. Below it, he had added a small sign that read, "Before you judge, remember to see." 6 months had passed since that memorable day in courtroom 3B. The Montgomery County Courthouse looked different now. In the main hallway, a small poetry library sat in what used to be an empty corner. Glass shelves held books of all kinds, but Sarah Bennett's collection had a special place in the center. Judge Richard Whitman stood at the podium in the courthouse's largest conference room. The room was packed with judges, lawyers, and court staff from across the country. They had all come for the first ever Justice and Understanding Conference. 6 months ago, Judge Whitman began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "I made a mistake that turned into one of the most important lessons of my career. Today, I'm honored to introduce the person who taught me that lesson." Sarah Bennett walked onto the stage, wearing a simple but elegant blue dress. The audience broke into loud applause. Many of them had traveled hundreds of miles just to hear her speak. "When I walked into that courtroom 6 months ago," Sarah said into the microphone, "I was just another face, another case number. But what happened next changed not only my life, but the lives of many others." In the audience, David Martinez sat proudly in his new suit. After that day, he had worked hard to create a program helping judges and court staff understand their hidden biases. The program was now being used in 20 different courts across the state. Sarah continued speaking, her voice strong and clear. "Change doesn't always come from big movements or loud protests. Sometimes it comes from small moments, from people willing to admit their mistakes and learn from them." She pointed to the back of the room, where a large screen showed pictures of the changes that had happened since that day. The courthouse poetry library had given out over 1,000 books. Judge Whitman's book club had grown to include staff from every department. Other courts had started similar programs. But the biggest change, Sarah said, smiling at Judge Whitman, happened in the hearts and minds of people who work in our justice system. Judge Whitman nodded, remembering how differently he now looked at each person who entered his courtroom. He took more time with each case, listened more carefully to each story. His new reputation for fairness had even earned him an award for judicial excellence. Last week, Sarah continued, a young woman came to court wearing clothes very much like the ones I wore that day. The old me would have worried about how she would be treated. But the new reality in this courthouse meant she was heard fairly, her story listened to with respect. The audience nodded in understanding. Many of them had made similar changes in their own courtrooms after hearing about what happened that day. Sarah held up her newest book, just published last week. Its title read, Justice Sees, Poems of Change and Understanding. The cover showed a courthouse with its doors wide open, welcoming all who entered. This book, she said, is dedicated to everyone who has the courage to admit their mistakes and learn from them, especially to a certain judge who showed us that it's never too late to change. Judge Whitman stood up, joining Sarah at the podium. Together, they unveiled a new plaque that would hang in every courtroom in the building. It read, Before you judge my story, make sure you've read the page. The conference room erupted in applause. In the back, a group of law students wiped tears from their eyes. They had been studying this case in school, and now they were watching history continue to unfold. As the day ended, Sarah walked through the courthouse one last time. She stopped at the poetry library, now named the Bennett Reading Room. Inside, a mother was reading one of Sarah's poems to her young daughter. The little girl looked up at Sarah and smiled. Are you the poet? She asked. Mommy says your words helped make this place better for everyone. Sarah nodded, knowing that the real change had come not just from her words, but from people like Judge Whitman, who had the courage to listen, learn, and change. The courthouse was no longer just a place of law, it had become a place of understanding, where every story got its chance to be heard.